jungle did not just swallow the boy that day. It swallowed time, sound, certainty, and the very idea that anyone could come back unchanged. And yet, 3 months later, when a thin, barefoot child walked out of the Amazon with eyes that looked older than the forest itself, the entire world would be left staring in silence. This is not just a story about a lost boy. It is a story about fear, survival, hope, and a return so shocking that even the people who had already given up on him could not find the words to speak. Stay with this story till the end, because the ending is not what anyone expected, and somewhere inside it is a lesson every one of us needs to hear. And if stories like this make your heart race and your mind stay glued, then go ahead and like this video. Comment what you think you would have done in that situation. Share it with someone who loves powerful true-style stories, and subscribe so you never miss another story that grips you from the first line to the last. His name was Elias, and he was only 12 years old when the world around him vanished into green. Not green like trees in a park, not green like a garden after rain, but the endless, living, breathing green of the Amazon rainforest, where every leaf seemed to watch, every branch seemed to listen, and every shadow could hide something beautiful or deadly. Elias had been traveling with his father and a small local expedition group near the edge of the rainforest, not because he was reckless, but because he was curious in the way children often are when they do not yet understand how big the world truly is. He asked too many questions, wandered a little too far, and believed, like many children do, that he could always find his way back if he just kept walking in the right direction. But the Amazon does not reward confidence. It tests it. The last time his father saw him, Elias had been trailing behind the group, staring at a bright blue butterfly that kept landing on branches just out of reach. His father turned for only a moment that seemed harmless at the time, and when he looked back, Elias was gone. At first, nobody panicked. That is the cruelest part of a sudden disappearance. Hope arrives before fear. Someone called his name. Someone else thought he had gone around a bend in the path. Then the minutes stretched, the air grew heavier, and the forest gave no answer. By the time the sun dipped lower and the shadows began to crawl across the ground, the search had already become a desperate race against darkness. His father shouted until his voice cracked. The guides pushed through thick vines and tangled roots. Flashlights sliced through the trees, helicopters were requested, trackers were called in, and every possible route was checked again and again. But the jungle is an expert at hiding its secrets. Sounds echo strangely there, footsteps vanish into mud, and even the smallest trail can disappear beneath a layer of leaves in seconds. The police said the same thing people always say when the odds are terrible. They would continue searching, but the chances were low. Low was a gentle word for a nightmare. For the first few days, everyone believed Elias might be found near the camp, exhausted, frightened, waiting to be rescued. They found nothing. Then they found a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, then a footprint half flooded by rain, then nothing again. The rainforest had begun to erase him. News spread quickly. People in towns nearby whispered about the boy from the expedition. Volunteers came. The family prayed. His mother, hundreds of miles away, refused to leave the phone even for a minute. She kept saying the same sentence over and over, as if repetition itself could keep her child alive. He is out there, he is out there, he is out there. The first week passed like a wound that never stopped opening. The second week was worse. Search teams rotated, exhaustion set in, and hope began to change shape. It no longer looked like certainty. It looked like refusing to stop moving. Elias' father did not sleep. He walked the edge of the forest with red eyes and a broken voice, staring into the green wall as if he could force the jungle to give his son back. And while the world followed the story with sympathy, the Amazon continued its own ancient rhythm, indifferent to headlines, indifferent to panic, indifferent to grief. But Elias was still alive. He did not know that anyone was still looking for him after the first several days. He only knew hunger, cold nights, The sound of insects screaming into the dark, the panic of footsteps that were not his own, and the terrible loneliness that comes when a child realizes the world has become too large and too quiet. He had run after the butterfly. That was all. One wrong turn, one long patch of vines, one moment of distraction. Then the path disappeared, and with it, every familiar sound. He called for his father until his throat hurt. He cried until he could not cry anymore. Then he waited, because children do that when fear grows too big for action. They wait for the adult world to appear and make things right. But no one came. During the first nights, he slept under roots, using leaves as cover. He drank rainwater from broad plants and tried to remember everything his father had told him about staying still, conserving energy, and not following strange sounds. But the jungle was full of strange sounds. Monkeys screamed overhead. Something large moved in the distance. Insects bit his skin until his arms and legs were covered with red marks. Once, he woke to the sound of something sniffing near him in the dark. He held his breath so hard it hurt his chest. He did not move. Whatever it was left after a few long seconds, and he learned a lesson that day no city child should ever have to learn. In the wild, fear can keep you alive if it makes you silent. By the fifth day, Elias had stopped crying entirely. He was too tired for tears. His stomach felt empty all the time, and his thoughts had become slow and strange. He started talking to himself just to hear a human voice. He counted steps. He counted leaves. He counted heartbeats. He found fruits he did not know by shape, smell, and the small test of biting only the tiniest piece and waiting to see if pain came later. He drank from streams, though he could never be sure they were safe. He made a tiny shelter from branches. He learned where ants crawled and where mud held the tracks of larger animals. The forest became both enemy and teacher. There were moments when he nearly gave up. One evening, after rain had soaked him to the bone and lightning split the sky like a torn sheet, he curled beneath a fallen tree and whispered that he wanted to go home. He imagined his mother's cooking. He imagined the sound of his own room door closing. He imagined school, boring and ordinary and safe. He imagined being annoyed by small things again. Because now even annoyance seemed like a gift. But imagination can hurt when reality refuses to obey. The home he pictured felt farther away than the moon. Days blurred into one another. The sun rose and fell. The jungle hummed and roared and breathed. Somewhere deep inside, something in Elias changed. He stopped thinking in hours and started thinking in survival. He noticed that certain birds gathered when there was water nearby. He noticed that ants moved in lines away from flooded ground. He noticed that moss often pointed him toward shade and coolness. He used broken branches to mark trails, though rain often erased them. He followed the sound of running water because he knew people need water more than pride. He learned to step lightly, to watch the ground before placing his feet, to listen before moving. What began as terror slowly hardened into endurance. Meanwhile, the search changed too. News crews arrived, then left. Officials gave updates with increasingly careful words. Some people began to assume the boy was gone forever. Some called it a tragedy. Others called it impossible. But Elias' parents would not accept that word. They kept going back to the forest edge, meeting rescuers, showing pictures, begging anyone who would listen to keep searching. His mother held a small notebook where she wrote every possible clue, every sighting, every rumor, every report. His father carried Elias' favorite cap in his hand, as if touching it could somehow guide him back to his son. Their grief became a kind of resistance. On the 18th day, a rescue volunteer named Raphael claimed he heard a whistle in the distance. The search paused. Everyone listened. Nothing came. Then 2 days later, a local fisherman reported seeing fresh signs of movement near a riverbank far from the original camp site. Teams moved again. Drones swept over the canopy. Dogs were brought in. But the Amazon is not a place where you simply find someone because you want to. It is a place where luck, patience, and stubbornness must somehow work together. Elias by then had crossed into a different part of the forest. He no longer recognized the landscape. He had lost weight. His hands were scratched raw. His knees were bandaged with bark and cloth he had torn from his own shirt. Yet something remarkable had happened. He was no longer only surviving by instinct. He was learning. He had watched animals more carefully than any adult ever could. He had learned that where monkeys fled, danger often followed. He had learned that birds sometimes scream before storms, and that the forest floor can lie. He had even started to predict rain by smell, because the air changed before the sky did. And then came the night that changed everything. Elias heard crying. At first he thought it was in his head. His mind had begun to play tricks after so much isolation. But the sound came again, thin and weak and unmistakably human. He froze, he listened. It was not his voice. It was smaller, younger. He followed the sound through undergrowth so thick it tore at his skin. Finally, in a shallow dip beneath tangled roots, he found a little capybara trapped in a muddy depression, trembling and unable to climb out. It was exhausted and frightened. Elias stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking too much, he used a branch, then another, then stones and mud to make a tiny ramp. The animal escaped slowly, weakly, and disappeared into the dark. It was a small moment, almost invisible in the huge violence of the forest, but Elias later said that after helping that creature, he felt less alone than he had in days. Maybe because saving something else reminded him he was still a person, not just prey. Maybe because kindness, even in the wilderness, has a way of returning to the one who gives it. Either way, from that night onward, Elias began to move with a strange new purpose. He was still frightened, but he was no longer only afraid for himself. He wanted to live, not just survive, live. One morning, after what experts later estimated was around the 70th day, Elias heard something he had not heard in a long time. A distant engine, human voices, not the wild echo of animals but real voices. He stopped dead still, heart hammering so hard he thought he might faint. He shouted, but his voice came out broken. He shouted again, no answer. He ran toward the sound, stumbled, fell, got up, and kept running. Then he heard a rescue whistle, sharp, clear, repeated. At that moment, the entire jungle seemed to lean in. The rescue team had been following a narrow tributary after spotting unusual footprints and broken branches near a mudbank. One of the searchers, a woman named Anna, noticed a small figure moving through the trees, so thin it hardly seemed possible. At first she thought it might be a reflection, or a trick of light, or another false hope the forest was throwing at them. Then the figure stepped into an opening, looked up, and raised one shaking hand. No one spoke for several seconds. Elias stood there in a torn shirt, his hair filthy, his face thinner than any child should ever be, his eyes sunken but alert. He looked at the rescuers as if he could not quite believe they were real. One man dropped to his knees. Another covered his mouth. Anna began to cry before she even reached him, but Elias did not run immediately. He just stared, as if waiting for the forest to pull the moment away. Then a voice called his name. Not from the jungle, not from memory, from a living person standing right in front of him. Elias broke. He ran. He collapsed into the arms of the first rescuer who reached him, and for a second he did not even know how to cry because too much emotion had filled him all at once. He shook violently. He clung to them with the desperate strength of someone who had spent too many nights believing no one was coming. They wrapped him in blankets, gave him water in tiny sips, checked his pulse, and rushed him toward medical care. But even as they did, one thing became very clear. This was not the same boy who had disappeared into the forest. When the news spread that Elias had been found alive after so long in the Amazon, disbelief hit first, then relief, then awe. Parents hugged their children a little tighter that night. News outlets described his survival as a miracle. Doctors were stunned by how he had managed dehydration, hunger, insect bites, injuries, and the constant threat of predators. Experts who studied the case said his survival came from a rare combination of instinct, quick learning, physical resilience, and extraordinary luck. But the public wanted to know something deeper. How had he lasted so long? What had he seen? What had he learned? What did it feel like to come back from a place that so many never returned from? At first, Elias did not answer much. He slept a great deal. He ate small meals. He flinched at sudden noises. He cried in the middle of the night sometimes. The forest had left marks not only on his body but on his mind. Yet even in those early days, the people around him noticed something astonishing. He was calmer than expected, more observant, more patient. He watched the sky through windows as if reading it. He noticed which foods were fresh by smell. He knew how to tie knots better than many adults. He could identify certain leaves and explain with a startling seriousness which ones had helped him when he was weak. He had become a child who had been forced to grow up faster than anyone should. The most shocking moment came when journalists finally got a few words from him through his family, and he said something that spread everywhere within hours. He said the forest was terrifying, but it also taught him how small pride is when hunger comes. He said he learned that silence can save you. He said he learned that the most important thing in the world is not being brave all the time, but refusing to stop believing that the next hour can be better than the last. And then he asked for his parents. When he saw them, all the strength he had built in the forest seemed to vanish at once. He ran into his mother's arms and buried his face there as if trying to make up for every day he had lost. His father held both of them and cried openly, without shame. The people watching could not hold back their tears either. The reunion was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. A family that had been torn apart by the wild and stitched back together by hope. But the story did not end with rescue. The real ending began afterward when Elias and his family returned to their lives and tried to understand what had happened to them. His school welcomed him back carefully. His teachers adjusted. His classmates looked at him with awe and curiosity. Some asked too many questions. Some barely knew how to speak to him. Elias, for his part, changed the way he looked at everything. He no longer complained about ordinary discomfort. He no longer took food for granted. He no longer wasted water. He listened when adults spoke about safety in a new way. The forest had given him trauma, yes, but it had also given him perspective. He understood now that life can change in a heartbeat, and that every normal day is a gift disguised as routine. The rescue team later returned to the area and mapped the route Elias had likely followed. They were amazed at the distance he had covered. They found signs that he had used terrain, water sources, and seasonal animal paths with remarkable intelligence. Some said it was impossible for a child that young. Others said perhaps children are more capable than adults believe when instinct is their teacher. Either way, Elias had done what few would have expected. He had not merely survived. He had adapted. His mother later said that after the rescue he became quieter but also more grateful. He would sit near the window at sunset and watch the sky turn gold, saying little as if he understood that beauty and danger can exist in the same world. His father said Elias no longer walked through life carelessly. He looked, he listened, he noticed. And maybe that was the greatest gift the jungle had given him, hidden inside the suffering, the ability to see life with new eyes. People often ask what the speechless return really was. Was it the fact that he came back alive after so long? Was it the way he walked out stronger than anyone imagined? Was it the silence of the rescuers when they first saw him? Or was it the silence that fell over everyone later when they realized the story was never just about being lost? The truth is, it was all of that. It was the impossible made real. It was a child standing at the edge of extinction and returning with a story that made the entire world stop talking. And perhaps that is why this story has stayed in people's hearts, because deep down, we all know what it means to feel lost in our own way. Not always in a forest, not always in danger, but sometimes in grief, in fear, in loneliness, in confusion, in life that feels too big and too wild to navigate. Elias reminds us that even when the path disappears, the will to keep moving can still carry us forward. Even when everything looks abandoned, hope can still find a way back. Even when nobody can see the child we once were, that child may still be fighting to return home. So remember this. Never underestimate resilience. Never take your family's presence for granted. Never assume a small person is too weak to endure a giant struggle. And never forget that the darkest places can still hold a way out, even if it takes longer than anyone expects to find it. The boy in the Amazon did not come back the same, and that is exactly why his return left everyone speechless. He came back with proof that survival is not only about strength. It is about patience, learning, courage, and the stubborn decision to keep believing when everything around you says stop. That is the moral of this story. Life can drag us into places we never wanted to enter, but even in the deepest wilderness, hope can become a compass, courage can become a shelter, and love can become the reason we find our way home.